bad news, and I have good news, and then I have more bad news. The bad news is that we are going to cover 17 chapters today. The good news is that the Tuesday group did it in an hour, so no pressure. The bad news is that I know we can now go through 17 chapters, so next week we're going to go through 18 chapters if the plan holds to finish out 1 Samuel. But the reason why we're doing it like this is because of this. Tonight we're going to cover the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is one of the most beautiful books in the entire Bible. Quite honestly, it's hard-pressed to put any other book outside of the Gospels next to it and go, yeah, they're equal, that they can keep up with it. It's a tiny book. It's only 4 chapters. But we would be doing such a disservice to ourselves and to the Word to just rush past it. So we're going to spend a little bit more time with Ruth than you would think we would for a book of this size. We're going to spend somewhere around 30 minutes going through it, which means we then have to cover the other 13 chapters that we're going to cover in 30 minutes, which means we're going to run pretty fast and hit some of the moments as highlights. And there's going to be aspects of it that we're just not even going to touch because it will be outside of the heights that we're trying to hit. However, the point of AC3 is not for me to tell you everything that's in the Bible. And it's not really for you to hear whatever my thoughts are on this passage or that passage. The point of AC3 is for you to be in your Word, to allow the Spirit of God to work through it and to change you and to make you into who He wants you to be so that you can take those lessons and then teach it to the next disciple in your path. So with that, let's start with the book of Ruth as we look at chapter 1. All right, I've already kind of gave you the beginning salvos of it, my initial thoughts. In the entire Bible, the book of Ruth stands out. It's just special. It's an incredibly special book. For one, it's one of only 2 books in the Old Testament named after a Gentile. Ruth, of course, being a Moabitess by birth, she will be one of them, and the other is Job, which sometimes we don't think about Job not being Hebrew, but he was. If his placement in history is where we think it is, then he was a contemporary of Abraham, and if he lived at the same time of Abraham, obviously he did not descend from Abraham, so he wouldn't have been an Israelite. But here's the other thing about Ruth. Ruth is one of only 2 books in the Bible who is named after a woman. One is Ruth, and the other is Esther. But what's so beautiful about these 2 particular books and the way that they come next to each other is that Esther is about a Jewish girl who marries a Gentile, and Ruth is about a Gentile girl who marries a Jew. And they form this wonderful bookend between the 2 in the Bible. But perhaps the biggest thing that stands out is where this book appears. If you're with us in AC3 and we finished the end of Judges, you remember how the end of Judges ended. And then we ended that, and I said, okay, you have 2 weeks off, and we're not going to meet for a study. And you're like, you got to be kidding me. I need this taste washed out of my mouth. And you did, and that answer was the book of Ruth. To read the book of Ruth right after Judges, and to understand that in history, this is where this story appears. What is arguably the most beautiful love story in the entire book is the book of Ruth. And I'm including the Song of Solomon when I say that. Because what elevates this book above the Song of Solomon is where it appears in history. The Song of Solomon appears at the beginning of the golden age of Israel, when Solomon had not yet lost his way, when he was still following the Lord with all the wisdom that God had given to him. But Ruth doesn't appear in that backdrop. It appears in what is described as one of the most wicked periods in all of Jewish history, where perhaps the single most disgusting and atrocious act that will happen in their history, when that happens, immediately follows after it the book of Ruth. Now, the wonderful biblical truth that gives us as we start going into our study is that even in the darkest of times, God always preserves a remnant unto himself. Even when we look at the world and go, how could it get any more evil? Surely all good has run away from this earth. God goes, and even now I maintain those who are mine. There is something so sweet, so pure, so relatable about the book of Ruth. In many ways, it's the living embodiment of the parable of the hidden treasure from Matthew chapter 13. In Matthew chapter 13, Jesus says this, "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and hid again, and from joy over it goes and sells all that he has, and he buys that field." It's a beautiful parable. There's this joy within the parable. There's this desire to have this land to make sure no one else can purchase it first. The way it's done, we're going to see all these elements in the book of Ruth. But as we start going into the book of Ruth, understand that Ruth is that treasure in the field. That's where Boaz will first see her. He's going to see her in the field. And he will buy the entire estate of Elimelech and Naomi in order to earn the right to marry her. So too our Jesus loved us so much that he paid for the sins of the entire world. He did all that just so he could have his bride. In chapter 1, we are introduced to Naomi and Ruth, and for time's sake, we're not going to have a chance to go into a lot of the details that we see right here with Elimelech, because there's questions that pop up. Why did they leave? Why did they go to Moab? Surely they could have stayed in Israel. There's ways to make it happen. They had boys. They could have worked the land because they never really lose the land. That's something that we'll find later on. We don't have time to discuss that today, but those are wonderful questions to discuss in small groups and in Q&A times. But they have two boys, and during this first chapter, we learn that Elimelech and the two boys will pass away. It doesn't say why they pass away or how they pass away, just that they passed away. And prior to the two boys passing away, they both married Moabite wives. Now, this appears to be a violation of the book of Deuteronomy. The Israelites were not to take Gentile daughters for their sons. And it's not so much that they couldn't marry anybody who wasn't an Israelite, but the idea is that you could not marry people who were still going to be a part of their culture. If you married them, they would become a part of the nation. They would become Jewish in that sense, but you're not allowed to marry people who would still hold to their cultures. But they break it here. They're in a foreign land, and they're marrying Gentile gals. What we learn after the passing away of her husband and her sons, Naomi hears that the Lord has lifted the famine in Israel, so she determines it's best for me to go back to my homeland, and she encourages both of her daughters to stay here, go home, go to your homes so you can remarry. And in verse 8 and 9, Naomi bestows a blessing on Orpah and Ruth, and this is going to be a beautiful pattern in the book of Ruth, because the book of Ruth, in 4 chapters, it's filled with 10 different blessings. That's more than 2 blessings per chapter. Both of the daughters-in-law, though, initially resist. They want to stay with Naomi. It speaks well of them. It speaks well of Naomi. But Naomi starts to articulate what your future is going to be if you come with me. She goes, I have no security, no more sons to give you. I don't even have a hope for sons. If I was going to be married today and get pregnant tonight, would you wait until they were old enough to marry you? You should go home. Now, that's honestly a stark future. What Naomi is telling them in Moab is that there is no future security for you if you come with me. When Orpah hears this, she kisses Naomi, her mother-in-law, and it's this act of sweet goodbye. We should not think poorly of Orpah. The choice just makes Ruth stand out all the more. Because when Ruth hears what her future will be, she clings to Naomi. That's the word that's used. She holds on to her and won't let her go. And Ruth declares a most beautiful heart for Naomi. And whatever may be alleged about Ruth in this book, and some people will see huge issues in what Ruth does here, what can never be taken away from Ruth is the heart that she has in this moment. And whatever may be alleged about Naomi in this book, and many things will be alleged about her by some, one thing that can never be taken away from her, there was something in Naomi Ruth could not ignore. And whatever that something was in her mother-in-law, she was willing to leave everything behind just to pursue after that. So Ruth asked Naomi, don't urge me to leave you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Now, the statement at the end of verse 16 is critical in understanding this particular book. It's so important in this matter. It's what will allow Ruth to be the great-grandmother of the future king of Israel and the great-great-grandmother of the future king who builds the temple. Per Deuteronomy 23, no one of Ammonite or Moabite descent, which Ruth was a Moabitess, No one of that descent could enter the assembly of the Lord up to the 10th generation. And we discussed that when we went through the book of Deuteronomy, that meant they couldn't come and be a part of the holy assemblies on the day of feast times or come to the tabernacle or participate in the sacrifices. It would essentially exclude them from Jewish life. And no one who came from these particular parentages could be a part of it up to the 10th generation. But that's going to be a huge problem. Because here we have Ruth. We will find out later that her great-grandson is David. And her great-great-grandson is Solomon, who will not only be the one to make sure the temple is constructed, he will be a part of dedicating the temple in its first ceremony. And that's a big issue. But because Ruth makes this declaration here in chapter 1, your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. She essentially becomes part of the nation of Israel here. The Jewish people become her people. The God of Israel becomes her God. It is very similar to what we see in Joshua chapter 6 with Rahab from the city of Jericho. And because of her heart to trust in the Lord, she becomes and has a place within the nation of Israel. Now, we need to understand something. This is how God sees her now. The moment she makes this declaration, as far as he's concerned, she is one of his people. But the world will continue to see her as a Moabitess, all the way until Ruth 4:10, when Boaz stands up and says, I will marry Ruth. And after that point, she's never called a Moabitess again. Naomi and Ruth will return to Bethlehem of Judah. That little tag on is important because if you remember where we've seen other lists of cities, like in the book of Joshua, you'll see Bethlehem belonging to a different tribe. That's a different Bethlehem. This is Bethlehem of Judah. It will be the city of David, and we're told that they come at the beginning of the barley harvest in verse 22. In chapter 2, now that they're back in the land, they need to do something for food. So Ruth asked Naomi for permission to go out and glean in the fields. What she's going to do is, as the barley harvest is going on and people are cutting down the barley stalks, what they would allow, according to the law, is that they could go and pick any of the bundles that fall free from the hand. So as you cut it down, you would kind of hug it and you would wrap something around it, either other pieces of sheaves or some kind of flax that would tie it off. But you wouldn't be able to get every last thing, and you weren't even really supposed to try. We saw that in the law as well. But those pieces that fall on the ground, as the harvesters moved on, the poor and the needy could come and just pick up whatever they could find on the ground. And it was supposed to be a form of welfare in order to support those who were in need. Ruth gives permission, and in verse 1, we're told she had a wealthy kinsman whose name was Boaz. Now, Boaz is a beautiful name. It means in him strength. We will see this name come up again when we look at the temple, because one of two pillars, two big columns that are inside of the temple of Solomon, one of them will be named Boaz. But Boaz is this wealthy kinsman, but he's not made known to Ruth here. It's not mentioned. It won't come on until later. When she asked for permission to go and glean in the field, Naomi doesn't go, yeah, and make sure you go to Boaz. He's really, really rich. She says, yeah, just go. And Ruth just so happens to end up in Boaz's field in verse 3. Now, while she is out there working, here comes Boaz, and everyone's been working for a while, but since he's the boss, he can come a little bit late. He shows up, and he goes and he greets everyone there in this beautiful greeting that shows his character and righteousness right off the back. He says, may the Lord be with you, and here's the beautiful part, his people see it back to him. Now, Boaz is wealthy. He's very wealthy, is what we're told in the text. He didn't have to come with respect for anybody else. He could have come and demanded what the count was and what they were doing, but instead we see him take the time to greet them, and then he brings this heart out of the people that work for him. This is one of those wonderful things that Boaz does. We'll see it in 1 Samuel when we get to the life of Jonathan as well. This is what Jonathan does. He brings his heart out in others. But as Boaz is sitting there talking to those working for him, he says, who is that? Because he's never seen Ruth before. He asks about her, and he's told she is from Moab, because that's what they see about her. She came with Naomi, and she has worked hard until now when she stopped to take a break in the shade. Now, this is what we have about her. This character about her is really wonderful. Boaz then talks to Ruth, and he says, remain at this property. Remain close by my servants so they can ensure your safety. Now, we need to understand, Boaz is not trying to prey upon Ruth. This isn't this old creepy guy trying to hit on this young gal. That's not what's going on. We need to remember that this is the time of the judges. Your safety was not guaranteed. So what he tells us is, you make sure you stay by my field. My servants will keep you safe. My servants will not lay a hand on you, and not even that, or not just that, but you won't even have to draw your own water when I'm here, because I'll tell them you're allowed to drink from the pitchers of water that they bring up. Now, that doesn't sound like much to us. But if you've been working all day in the field, and if you want to drink water, you have to go draw your own water and pull it up out of a well, having somebody already pull it up for you, and you just take a cup and go drink. That's a great thing. So he's trying to be generous to her. Ruth expresses her appreciation for Boaz's kindness, and he asks, why are you being so kind to me? Verse 11 is important. Boaz says, word has spread regarding the quality of your character. Now, this speaks well of both of them. Ruth's character was such that it was demonstrated by her actions, and Boaz's character was such that he noticed Ruth's character. I mean, how was her character demonstrated? By what she surrendered, what she left behind to follow Naomi, namely everything. Boaz prepares a place for her to belong. When the team that's harvesting stops to eat, he prepares a place for her, and he welcomes her into the fellowship with them. And he tells her, dip your bread into this vinegar. And the idea is a wine vinegar, so it's kind of a dip or a sauce, like if you went to a restaurant and they pour the olive oil on the table. It's a similar kind of thing, only with a wine vinegar. And he gives her some roasted grain, so they would take the grain and pass it over a fire to give it a little crisp and bring out the flavor of it. And both of these were meant to be seen as kind of a delicacy. It was an additional bonus on top of the meal. But what we need to start to see here are the many allusions to Christ and his interaction with the church, but really in this moment. Understand this. In order to be in this fellowship with Boaz, Ruth had to leave everything. If you want to be in fellowship with Jesus, you must leave everything behind. The blessing of Boaz is that Ruth would be blessed under the wings of the Lord, where she is seeking refuge. Or Jesus does the same for us. We are only receive the blessing that he wants to bless us with when we are underneath the arms of the Lord our God. He gives her wine vinegar and roasted grain. These speak of the bread and the cup in communion that you enjoy within that fellowship meal. And we're told that after she eats, she is completely full and she has some left over, just like the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000, where everybody ate until they were full and they still had leftovers to take away. Now, after the meal, Boaz commands his servants, I want you to be generous to Ruth. Make it easy for her to glean wherever she wants. Wherever she wants to go, even if she doesn't know our ways, you just let her go. He says, even if she ends up within all the standing grain, you haven't even gotten there yet. The stuff is still on the stalk and it's up high. You let her pick whatever she wants. And this is a huge blessing because it means she doesn't have to bend down to pick up the stuff off the floor. It's all right there at shoulder height. It's going to be perfect. And still the best buds would be on it. And he goes, I want you to make sure that when you're bringing them up, don't be stingy and get every piece. Make sure you take handfuls of it and leave it on the ground. So now when she comes up behind you, she doesn't have to scour through the bits of the plants and through the flax. No, there's just bundles of it right in front of her. And she'll go and she will collect all this together. But note this, Ruth still has to glean. He doesn't say, I want you to get extra ones and tie them off and put her name on and she'll just take it at the end of the day. She still has to work in the field. But his generosity makes it easy for her to work. Just like with our Jesus, there's still a yoke. But his yoke is easy, and his burden is light. Now, we're told the result of Ruth's hard work at the end of the day. She gets all that she has, she threshes it out, she binds it up, and she takes it home. And she takes so much that she has a full ephah of barley, which weighs about 30 pounds. And when you think about that this is barley, that's a lot of barley. It's enough food to last for several days. That's what it tells us. Usually, you work for whatever you needed to eat that day. And the next day, you would work again, and so on and so forth. But she has so much in this one moment that they have enough food for several days. And when Naomi sees the bounty of food, she goes, where did you go? Where did you glean? And who blessed you this day? And Ruth goes, Boaz. Naomi praises God for not withdrawing his kindness from them. And then she explains to Ruth that Boaz is a relative. In fact, he's one of our closest relatives. Now, Ruth tells Naomi, well, he told me to stay close to his field, stay close to his servants, and stay there until the harvest was done. Again, huge allusions to the instructions of Jesus for us, right? This is the instructions he gives to the church. Stay close to other servants of the king, lest you be found by the enemy vulnerable and alone. And you stay close to them until the harvest is done. But Naomi hears this instruction, and she tells Ruth, you need to do what he said. Verse 22 explains why. It's the dangers at the time of the judges. Naomi tells Ruth to stay close to the servants of Boaz so that she will be safe. The ESV puts verse 22 this way at the end. Lest in another field you be assaulted. That's the idea. In chapter 3, we see that the harvest has at last come to a close. Naomi goes into more detail about who Boaz to their family. He's more than just a relative. He's a close relative. But what she is expressing to Ruth is that Boaz is our Goel. G-O-E-L. Goel. Goel is a Hebrew word. We would say that he is the kinsman redeemer. He is the close family relative who can redeem us in times of trouble. The kinsman redeemer has several obligations in a family. They have the obligation to redeem a family member who's been sold into slavery, to purchase back land that was sold before the Jubilee. But most importantly to Ruth, the kinsman redeemer has a responsibility to raise up a child for a widow of a close family member, to provide for her security, and to make sure that his brother's name will not disappear from Israel. And is this that Naomi is referring to when she says, should I not seek security for you? To have a future, to have someone who can take care of you as you get older. Now, Naomi goes from the fact that Boaz is their close relative, specifically calling him their kinsman, to directing Ruth how to approach him with this request. Now, here are the instructions, and then I'll start explaining. Naomi tells Ruth, I want you to go get yourself cleaned up. I want you to go see Boaz, and I want you to do it at night. Now, this may seem very inappropriate to us when we look at this. But understand within the culture and for the circumstances, it is both appropriate and reasonable. So let's break it down. It may seem very forward to us for Ruth to go and approach Boaz. But this is in keeping with the law of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 25. Deuteronomy chapter 25. This is where there is a widow of a close family member, but they have no kids. The widow, not her mother, not a friend, but the widow herself was to go to the kinsman redeemer and demand the full obligations for the brother. You must fulfill the obligations of the kinsman redeemer and raise up children to his name. And if he refuses, she goes and makes it a bigger public issue. She goes to the city gates, she goes to the elders, and she presents the situation before them. But she's going at night. That's true. Here's why. As a widow in Israel at this time, she had some protected rights within the culture. As a Moabitess, she had none. Therefore, Ruth comes at night for probably the same reason that Nicodemus came to Jesus at night in John chapter 3, to protect his reputation and her reputation. This was after the harvesting work was done, so there's no reason for her to be here except to petition Boaz. But coming at night does another thing as well. It gives Boaz the freedom to reject her request and not subject Ruth to the shame of a rejection, because no one else would know about it. Well, what about sprucing herself up? That just seems unseemly. Well, let me ask you a question. Did any of you come here in the same condition as you were when you rolled out of bed this morning? Did you brush your teeth? Did you at least change clothes? Or did you roll out of bed in all your glory to make sure your church family could experience the fullness of you? Of course not. You weren't doing anything unseemly. You're just taking pride in your appearance. You're just making yourself presentable. So if that's innocent, why is what Naomi doing in verse 3 scandalous? Okay, maybe. But what about verse 4? Naomi tells Ruth, I want you to go in there, and while he's asleep, I want you to uncover his feet. Well, that just seems indecent to me. That's actually the most beautiful part of the moment. what Ruth is doing in this, that Naomi is relaying to her, is that you are going to present yourself with an act of humility to Boaz. So during the time of the harvest, what they would do is they'd all gather together, and they would take the sheaves that they had bundled, and they would beat them down, and they would thresh them, and the wind would blow away the flax, and all that kind of good stuff. And then they would see how much fruit they actually had from the harvest. It would be a time of celebration. You know, this is when we can actually start to see what the prophet might be. So they would eat, and they would drink, and they'd be merry, then they'd go to sleep right where they were. What you would do, and especially Boaz, for somebody who had a little bit of means, he would probably go to sleep on a mat or something like that. But if not, you would just wrap yourself in a big cloak and kind of go to bed, which is why we're told in the law, when you go and you take a pledge for somebody who's poor, all they would have is their big, heavy cloak. Do not leave them without that cloak at night, otherwise they'll be cold in the middle of the night. So what he probably did was just flop down on the ground, and he would wrap himself in a big garment or a big cloak. What would happen is if you had a servant, and your servant slept in the same room as you, what they would do is you would lie there, and they would lie down at your feet from side to side. And if they were cold, what the servant was allowed to do was to reach up and grab the garment from your feet and pull it over themselves as their covering. And that way, if the master needed the servant during the night, the servant was right there. They would be at hand. And by her coming in this position and uncovering his feet and then lying in that position of a servant, what she is asking for is for him to cover her with his protection and his authority while she offers herself not as bride and not as something unseemly, but as servant. When Ruth goes in and she does all that she's been asked to do, she speaks with Boaz. In verse 8, we're told that he kind of just suddenly wakes up in the middle of the night and shoots up, and he sees her there. He sees a woman there, and he's like, "Who are you?" And she explains, "I'm Ruth." But watch what she calls herself: "Ruth, your maidservant." Not your bride, not you owe me, not you have to. She comes humbly. She calls herself his maid, which again speaks of the humble and submissive nature of her request. And then she asks him to spread his covering over her. Now, he understands the fullness of this request. She's not presenting herself unseemly, but he understands that she is asking for his covering to come over her as kinsman redeemer. She's not asking for charity. She's invoking this obligation, and Boaz praises Ruth in verse 10 and 11. It's beautiful. I love the way he characterizes her. He says, "Everyone knows that you are a woman of excellence." That is fantastic. That is right up there with Proverbs 31. That's the Shabbat dinner when the husband will stand up and he will praise the wife in front of the family. And there are many wonderful women, but there is no one like you. That's this kind of moment when he says to her, "You are a woman of excellence." It's such a magnificent compliment, especially coming out of the book of Judges. Because remember what it is that Samson saw when he went after somebody. "You need to get her for me because she looks good to me." This is what speaks so well about Boaz. He doesn't mention how attractive Ruth is. I'm sure she is lovely. But he is drawn to her character. Boaz informs Ruth, "Indeed, I am a close relative. But there's one who's closer, who has the first right of redemption." And it brings up an interesting detail regarding the kinsman redeemer. That in order to be the Goel, the person has to be three things. They have to be first, they have to be able, and they have to be willing. Boaz is only two of those three. He is able. He has the money to do what she needs done. And he's willing. But he's not first. There's a relative who's close. But he tells her, "Be at peace." He reassures her that no matter what, if this closer relative will do this thing and provide the security for you, okay. But no matter what, it will not get further than me. You will have security and you will be redeemed. Now, he tells her, "I want you to go ahead and sleep here." And she sleeps that night at his feet. Now, she stays for the night because, again, what is this age? It's the age of the judges. It's the time of the judges. And it would be dangerous for her to travel by herself at night. And if you don't believe me, remember what we saw happen in Judges chapter 19 with the Levite's concubine. The evil that was done even among Jewish people at night. Also notice where she lies down. Not by his side. She doesn't snuggle up to him. She lies at his feet. This is still that position of servitude and humility. It's not one of intimacy. He's protecting her and her reputation. And then they get up at dawn. but they go before anyone can recognize the other person. So this, again, is brilliant. It speaks back to what we know in Judges chapter 19, verse 25, that when the evil of the night was, when they stopped doing that evil, was when the dawn began to break. When finally you couldn't hide what was going on anymore, that's when it stopped. So now she's safe to go and walk home. But it's before anybody can recognize who it is that has come, and he's doing this because he's protecting her reputation. Because everybody knows who Boaz is, but he sends her away so that nobody can speak poorly of her. As Boaz sends her away, he gives her 6 measures of barley. Now, here's the interesting thing. We don't actually know how much he gave her. In the Hebrew, it just says 6. He gives her 6 of barley. We don't know the measure. But the idea that we can take away from it is he gave her all she could carry. Whatever the maximum amount is that she could take home, that's what he gave to her. And what it does is it acts as a sweet reassurance of what he promised her, that you will be taken care of, that you will be redeemed. And this is exactly how Naomi takes it, because we'll see it down in verse 18. When she sees this enormous gift that Boaz gives to Ruth, she goes, "Be at peace, child. He will not rest until he sees this matter done today." In chapter 4, we see Boaz now doing what Boaz does. He goes to the gate, and he waits until this close relative shows up. We never have the name of the close relative. We just know they're a close relative. When he sees the close relative, he says, "Come, sit down with me." And then he calls 10 elders from the gate, and he says, "Come and sit down as well." Now, what he's doing, everybody understands it, is he's calling a public official forum. What happens next is a legal proceeding. Now, I love what Boaz does. I just, his wit and his craftiness, and I mean no negative connotations with that, is fantastic. But what he's going to do is he's going to present the financial opportunity to the close relative. Now, the opportunity is there. And Elimelech and Naomi still have all of this land. They're coming out of a famine. So if you have farmable land, especially land that has not been used and therefore is nutrient-rich now, that was like hitting the jackpot. And so whoever was willing and able to buy it, they would have this huge profit boom coming out of it. So it's a brilliant thing. But watch how he does it. He was like, "You know what? I just found out, thought I'd mention it. But our relatives come back, and they kind of need to live to get by. So they're going to sell the land, but you're the first one in line. If you want it, great. If not, I'm the next in line. I guess I'll be the one to buy it and make sure it stays in the family." Now, the relative agrees immediately to buy the land. No questions. "Oh, yes, I'll do this. This is good." But now Boaz plays the master stroke. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention. At the time that you purchase the land, you also need to marry Ruth, a Moabitess. Throws it in there for good measure. Now, upon hearing this news, the relative backs out. He says it would jeopardize my own inheritance. We don't know why. We're not sure of the reason. Doesn't give it to us. There's a lot of ideas. There's a specific parable from Jesus that I'll let you go and search out on your own that might tie into it. But regardless, he goes, "I can't do it. You do it." And as proof of his refusal, that he was given the opportunity and he passed on it, he takes off his sandal and he gives it to Boaz. Now, this shows us that this is in keeping with the Deuteronomy chapter 25 moment. That he gave the right of redemption to Boaz, and now Boaz is first, able, and willing. So Boaz publicly declares his intention to marry Ruth. "I will buy this land, and at the time that I do it, I will marry Ruth the Moabitess." And that's the last time you will see that applied to her name. Ruth and Boaz marry at the end of the book. Naomi gets to hold her first grandson, and the grandbaby is named Obed, which means worshiper. It speaks of the journey that Naomi has taken all the way since the beginning of the book, especially when you consider that at one moment, Naomi, which her name means sweetness, said, "Do not call me that anymore. Call me Mara, for the Lord has dealt bitterly with me." And now when this baby has been named, it's named Obed. We're told that he's the grandfather of David, and as we close the book of Ruth, we see the genealogy of David. And we have this genealogy here in preparation for the reign of the greatest king of Israel during the age of the kings. Now, 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel picks up in the shadow of Ruth. Ruth acts as this transition point between the time of the judges and then the time of the kings. The person who is the transition between those two is Samuel. Samuel will be the last of the judges during the time of the judges, and it will be him who anoints the first 2 kings of Israel. We need to notice that while he's a Levite by birth, he's introduced as an Ephraimite. And that's likely because that while he is a Levite, he is not a descendant of Aaron, therefore he's not part of the Aaronic priesthood. He will do some priestly duties, but he's not a priest. He is a judge, and he is a prophet, but he's not a priest. Only one will serve in that leadership role, that worship role, and that prophetical role, and that is Christ and Melchizedek. What we see in the beginning chapter of 1 Samuel is we're introduced to the parents of Samuel. Really, so much of the time is spent on Hannah. But she is married. She's married to a gentleman named Elkanah. Elkanah seems to be a man who has a heart for God. He makes sure his family always goes up for annually to the feast and to offer sacrifices to the Lord. But Elkanah has two wives. One of them is sweet Hannah, but the other one is Peninnah, and we are told that Peninnah would torment Hannah just ruthlessly because she couldn't bear children. Peninnah is referred to as Hannah's rival in verse 6. This is how she feels it when we later get to the prayer of Hannah, which we won't have time to go into, sadly, today. There's multiple references to this rival who picks at you, this person who seems to be strong in the face of your weakness. But every year when they go up to Shiloh, which is where the tabernacle was, Elkanah would offer a peace offering to the Lord. And we've talked about this when we went through Leviticus, that as part of that, you would offer the animal. Certain portions would go to the priest. The rest of the animal would go to you. And then you would go and you would eat this meal, and it was like you were eating it with the Lord. It celebrated the fellowship and the peace that we have with the Lord. But when he does this, he goes home and he takes the animal, and everybody gets a portion. But he always gave a double portion to Hannah because he loved her. Despite this, Hannah wept because of the torment of her rival, and she would not eat. And in verse 8, Elkanah did the dumb guy thing. He starts talking without understanding, and he says, "Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" Now, there's lots of sweetness and stupidity all wrapped up in the same statement. We need to understand Elkanah was trying to make her feel better. But he doesn't understand her pain. Grasp that. This is Proverbs 14:10 in action. That the heart knows its own bitterness. A stranger does not share its joy. Nobody knows the fullness of your heart, except for one. And it's this response of the only one in the entire moment that's trying to make her feel better. It's the response of this one that prompts Hannah to go off by herself. Because no one around her understands what she's going through, she goes to try to find the only one who does. And where does that journey take her? To the tabernacle. Now, Hannah goes to the tabernacle in chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, and she prays. She just empties her heart out. But everything about this prayer is beautiful, starting with the condition of her heart in verse 10. She is distressed, so she prays and she weeps bitterly. This is where it starts. She's not angry at the Lord. She's not jealous of Peninnah. She's broken. And from this humble condition, Hannah cries out to the only one who understands and can do something about her condition. What did we just leave in the book of Ruth? There has to be one who's first able and willing, and God is first able and willing. And so she brings this care and concern to him. Now, Hannah pledges a vow to the Lord. If you give me a child, I will give that child back to you, and he will observe a lifelong Nazirite vow. Now, the mention of a Nazirite vow likely points to Hannah using the story of the birth of Samson as kind of an encouragement during her time of difficulty. Now, God will answer her prayer, but we need to understand something. God is not swayed by her bargain. It's not why he does what he does. But he is totally moved by the brokenness of her heart. Because notice what it is that she does, right? What she does not do is say, if you give me a child, I'll give you something really, really, really good. I will be the best tither in all of Israel. I'll make sure to give you lots of stuff every single year. That's not what she does. What she says is, if you give me the thing that my heart says it wants the most, I will give that to you. That's what she does. That's a remarkable thing. Hold on to that. We'll revisit it in a bit. But while she's sitting here praying, Eli, the high priest, is sitting there. Now, we're told they used to just sit by the door. Later on, we'll learn he's quite a heavy man, so he's probably sitting there because he's not going to walk around. So he's just sitting there watching people come and worship. And while she's sitting there praying, her lips are moving, but he doesn't hear a sound. So he assumes she's drunk. So he says, really? You're going to come and be drunk around the tabernacle? And the response of Hannah in verse 15 is just perfect. I am not drunk, but I am a woman oppressed in spirit, and I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Such beauty, such honesty. Eli hears this. What's he going to say now? He blesses Hannah. And she goes back to her camp, and look at the end of verse 18. Her face was no longer sad. Now, Hannah will conceive and bear a son. She names the boy Samuel, which means his name is El, or the name of God, because I asked for him from the Lord. When Samuel was weaned, which will put him somewhere during his second year of life, so between 2 and 3, but somewhere before 3, he will finally be weaned. And during that annual trip, they took him to the tabernacle. And she brings Samuel, and she brings the elements of a burnt offering. Now, there's a lot of scholarly study that could go into it. Most of your Bibles will say something about a 3-year-old bull, but that might not be what's going on. She's bringing the elements of a burnt offering. So she brings a bull, and she brings the wheat offering and the wine offering that go along with it. But there's so much of the other two. What we think may actually be going on is that she didn't bring one bull offering, a bull for a burnt offering with lots of stuff, that she actually brought 3 bulls for burnt offerings. Regardless, even if it's only one, here's the thing to be aware of. That meant the family was wealthy. You only offered a bull if your family had money. Bulls were the offering of the rich. The sheep were the offering of the middle class. The birds were the offering of the poor, which is why the parents of Jesus bring birds when it's time to do the offerings for him. But here's what I want you to understand. Her family had money. But regardless of how much money they had, she could not buy the one thing she wanted. And I can only imagine how strong the temptation was on her travel up to Shiloh to break her vow to the Lord. She has no idea if she's going to have more children. Now, she will. She'll have lots of children. But she has no idea if this is the only boy I will ever have. The temptation to keep him back, to switch him with anything else. But this is the quality of Hannah. This is my vow before the Lord. I asked, he gave, so I must give back. And she not only does it at all, she doesn't do it grudgingly, she does it with great blessing. Burnt offering, we are totally dedicated to you. Thereafter, Hannah's time with Samuel would be limited to yearly visits, where she'd come and she'd bring him a change of clothes whenever they made their annual sacrifice. But again, she's not bitter. Chapter 2 starts with this beautiful prayer by Hannah. We do not have time to go through it, but there's just a couple of verses in verse 4 and 5 I would direct your attention to, where she talks about the bows of the mighty being shattered, the feeble girding on strength, that those who are hungry cease to hunger, and even the barren give birth. This is her praise. She's just crying out to the Lord. Now, contrasted to Hannah and Samuel, or Eli and his wicked sons, starting verse 12. Eli was the high priest at the time. He was also judge. He appears to have been a moral man by and large, but his sons were very wicked. Their sins are listed in verses 12 through 17, and again in verse 22. And according to 1 Samuel 2:29, he refused to correct his sons like he should have. Now, later when Eli gets older, we'll see him rebuke his sons finally for their wickedness. And he points out to them, if you sin against man, then someone can intercede on your behalf. But nobody can intercede on your behalf. No one can stand in the gap if you sin against God. Even though I am the high priest, I can't stand on your behalf if you continue to do this wickedness. But the sons refuse to heed the warning of Eli. So what God does is he sends a prophet to Eli to declare to him the coming judgment upon the house of Eli. That you guys are currently the family of the high priest, but that's going to be ripped away from you. It'll become an issue later on in the life of Saul because he has a priest from the house of Eli continuing to be the high priest. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. But he says, this is what's going to happen because of verse 22. Because you chose to honor your sons over the Lord. That verse is like an arrow to the heart of so many who make their entire family about their kids. He says, you don't honor your kids before the Lord. You honor your Lord above your kids so that the Lord can protect your kids and be with your kids and guide your kids. But this is what Eli failed to do. And because Eli failed to do it, their entire future will be placed in jeopardy. In chapter 3, we see God shift his attention now to little boy Samuel. We're told that Samuel, when he was a boy, the voice of the Lord spoke rarely to the people during that time. Now, the Hebrew word for boy, when it refers to as Samuel, could be translated as lad. It's really any age between an infant and preteen, anywhere between those. But you might think of somebody running around like Josiah's age, so you're a young boy, able to help out, do stuff in it. But we're told that while he was sleeping that night, that the Lord began to call out to Samuel. And he calls out to him 3 times. If the first 3 times are like the 4th time that he does it, what Samuel hears is, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel sits up in bed and goes, here I am. And he goes running to Eli, because who else is going to call him at this time of night? So he runs to Eli, and Eli goes, I didn't call you, my son. Go back to bed. And he does this 2 times. Now the 3rd time, and after the 3rd time, he realizes that the Lord is calling out to Samuel. But I love the way that Samuel responds, because it shows a heart that's faithful. This is what God sees in Samuel. And so Eli tells him, well, the Lord is calling to you, so what I want you to do is I want you to go back to bed, and if the voice comes to you as it did the other times, I want you to say this, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Now, this wonderful advice, beautiful wisdom, but it's heartbreaking at the same time, because what this tells us is that Eli recognized the voice of the Lord when he was speaking to others, but not when the prophet was talking to him. And he counsels Samuel to do something that he didn't do in his own life. Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. That's not what came from his own lips. God calls to Samuel again and says, Samuel, Samuel, and Samuel responds as Eli instructed him to, and then God proceeds to tell him the judgment that's coming upon the house of Eli. This is a very hard message for a very little boy. Samuel's probably really the only father he's known. Eli is the only father that Samuel's known. Eli had a heart for Samuel. You see it the way that he refers to him multiple times. He calls him son. There seems to be this tenderness. We know that Samuel's heart will be burdened and fearful for the message that he's been given. But this becomes a huge test for a little boy. Will you still be faithful, or will you honor Eli above the Lord? In the morning, Eli asks what the Lord spoke to him, and he says, do not keep anything back. Tell me the full truth. And Samuel's faithful. He reports the vision he's been given, and to Eli's credit, Eli responds with, what's the Lord? Let him do what seems good to him. Out of this, the reputation of Samuel will begin to spread. And now that God has a servant he can trust in Israel, we're told that the Lord begins to appear again at Shiloh. Now, verse 21, where it says the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, is a counterpoint to verse 1, where it said that the voice of the Lord was rare during that time. And what's the difference? Samuel, the servant he can trust. In chapter 4, we're now come out to the broader scene, what's going on historically at the time Israel is being oppressed by the Philistines. In verse 1 and 2, Israel's defeated in battle by the Philistines, and the response of the people is not to repent. Think about all the times we saw it in the book of Numbers and in the book of Judges whenever there was something going wrong. Think about Joshua in the battle at Ai, and they lost it. What do? They come before the Lord, they mourn, and they repent, and they go, what is it? And he addresses the sin, but they don't do this here. Instead, they go, you know what we need? We need the ark. We need our holy rabbit's foot, and if we have our lucky charm, then we'll be able to defeat the Philistines. So they go and they get it and they celebrate. And the Philistines are kind of scared, but they go, listen, if they win, they're going to be terrible taskmasters, so let's get to fighting. And then they defeat the Israelites, and they seize the ark and kill the 2 sons of Eli, who were escorting the ark while it was there. Now, word from the battle goes back to Shiloh. It reaches Eli. He's sitting down, of course, as he has been since chapter 1. And he receives word about the death of his sons, and that has to be terrible. But we're told that when he heard that the ark was taken, he falls over backwards out of his seat. He lands on and breaks his neck because he was old and he was heavy. In chapter 5, we see the Philistines take this ark now, and they take it to the temple of their god Dagon. Now, what they're doing is they're taking the ark on kind of a victory tour. They're going to take it to their God and put it before him kind of like an offering, like, look what we've done. Look what our God did. Our God is stronger than the God of the Israelites. That's the idea. So they're all excited, and they close the doors, and they leave for the night, and they show up the next day, and they find out that the statue of Dagon has fallen on his face in front of the ark. They're like, that's odd. That's not how we left it. And because it's falling on its face in front of it, it's the idea of it falling in worship before the ark. Because later we're going to learn that the head and the hands are both going to break off on a singular linear point on the threshold. It seems likely that Dagon's had his arms raised, so when it fell down, it was like it was bowing down to the ark. Well, they go, okay, well, let's pick this up, and let's come back on another day. They come back the next day, but now the statue has moved. It's on the ground again. It's on the floor, but it's like it was running away because it falls down at the threshold, the door, and the head and the hands have broken off of it, and they're going, this is really weird. Now, the message is interesting. It may be with the head and the hands being broken that God was telling the Philistines that your God cannot see, nor can he help. And as proof of this, he begins to strike down those in the city with death, tumors, and later on we'll see mice. Now, this is the elementary Anthony coming out. One of the potential interpretations of the Hebrew word for tumors is hemorrhoids, which just cracks me up when I find out later that they make little golden replicas of what it is that has been struck on him, but that's the adolescent kid, and apparently you too. So what we see then is they go and they move it to a different city. They're like, it's just bad luck here. Let's move it to the next one, and it happens there too. Then they move it to a third city. They move it to the city of Ekron, and when they do, the people in the city start to weep. Here comes the Ark of the Covenant. They're trying to kill us, and the plagues hamper them as well. In chapter 6, the Philistine leaders all get together. There's actually 5 Philistine cities, and they're like, we're not bringing it to all of them. 3 is enough. We need to figure out what to do. So they called the diviners and the priests of the Philistines. And what's interesting is that the diviners and the priests have a better understanding of what's going on than the Israelites. But they tell them, you have offended the God of Israel. So you need to send the ark back. But don't send it back empty-handed. You must give it a guilt offering when you send it back. So you are to build 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice to represent the 5 Philistine cities. You're going to put it in a box next to the ark, and you're going to put it on a cart and send it to the nearest Jewish town. Now, it just so happens that the Jewish town they send it to is a Levitical city. We don't know if the Philistines knew this, but that's going to be very important. So they put it on this cart, and they let it go, and as it goes towards the city, the people in that city start to celebrate. They see it, they start to offer burnt offerings and sacrifices to the Lord, and that's fantastic. Everything's going really, really well. And then verse 19 through 21, they look in the ark. It may have been completely innocent why they did so. We just want to make sure nobody messed with it. There's nothing unclean on the inside of it. But here again, it's a Levitical city. We're even told that there's Levites in this city. And they knew better. They knew that according to God, that nobody except the family of Aaron was even allowed to see the Ark of the Covenant. But Anthony, the Philistines are just putting it on a cart. They've been running it all over. They put it in their temple of their false god. Why didn't they get judged? Because they didn't know better. And the Levites knew better. The truth of how to handle and interact with the ark was given to them, and accountability always starts at the top. Now, in chapter 7, we see that after the people of the Levitical city were struck down, about 50,000, they go, we got to move this on. So they move it on to the next city that seems to be on a line towards Shiloh, like they were just going to bump it to the next city till eventually got to where the tabernacle was. When it gets there, we think that one of the guys was a priest, a descendant of Aaron, or at least a Levite, and they're ordained with keeping up with the ark, and they do so for about 20 years. During this time, Samuel begins to judge Israel, and he begins by calling the people to repentance. It's always the first move after a time of wickedness. It's what we see with John the Baptist. It's what we see with Jesus. What's the first words of their ministry? Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. This is what Samuel does with the Israelites. He calls them to repent. So they start to gather to Samuel, and he's going to offer offerings to show that we are dedicating our hearts to the Lord. Now, when the Philistines heard that the Israelites were all getting together, they assume it's for another battle. So they start to gather their army together, and they're going to come and descend upon these Israelites and teach them a lesson. Now, when the Israelites heard the Philistines are coming, they start getting scared. Samuel says, do not stop crying out to the Lord. And while they're crying out to the Lord, he starts offering a burnt offering. And while he's offering the burnt offering, we're told that the Philistines come and descend upon them. But the Lord causes great thunder to ring out. The Philistines became confused in their attack. The Israelites counterattacked and routed the Philistines and drove them away. Now, one thing I need you to hold on here. It's going to be real important in just a minute in the life of Saul. Who's offering the burnt sacrifice? Samuel. He was the one to offer this as representative of the people before the Lord as the judge during this time. Now, after this great victory, Samuel sets up an Ebenezer stone. It's a beautiful moment. Ebenezer means stone of God's help. Stone of God's help is what Ebenezer means. It was to help them remember what the Lord had done that day. But how many times in the life of Israel have we seen these monuments of stone in order to convey what it is that the Lord has done for them, most especially and recently for us, was Joshua. When they were in the Jordan, they took those 12 stones, they brought them out, they put them in a city to remind them. That's going to be important because we're going to see that city later on as well. All right, chapter 8. Samuel starts getting older. We're told that Samuel was judge all of his life, but as he gets older, he has a couple of sons, and he makes them judges too. The idea is that he's starting to take some of his responsibilities and put it onto the next generation. He's getting too old to make the circuit. He's allowing them to do some of the work as well, but the problem is that the sons of Samuel reportedly do not walk in his ways, so the people have concerns. They just got out of a bad leader with bad kids. And I say, you know what? We don't want your sons to be leaders over us. Instead, give us a king so we can be like everyone else. Now, as you would imagine, this request for a king is upsetting to Saul, Samuel, because they're refusing Samuel and they're refusing his kids, and that's got to hurt and sting a little bit. But Samuel goes to the Lord and he prays, and God tells him, I need you to listen to their request because they're not rejecting you. This isn't about you, Samuel. They're rejecting me myself. And so there's a couple of thoughts wrapped up into this, but we only have time to just mention one. They rejected God because they did not trust that God knew that the sons of Samuel were a problem. They didn't trust God to overcome a good man with bad kids. They didn't trust that God would raise up the proper judge, that he was always seeking after that kid that he could call out to, and he would say, speak, Lord, for your servant hears. They didn't trust him to be strong enough or present enough or care enough, even though the life of Samuel demonstrated that God will overcome bad kids coming from a righteous man. This is how they reject God. But he says, you need to go warn them what they're asking for. Same thing we saw in Deuteronomy, right? Here's all the things that are going to come for the curse. Here's the curses that are going to come upon you if you fail to keep the law. So you can't say you didn't know. So Samuel does it. He goes and he tells them, this is what it's going to be like when you have a king. And he gives them 7 he wills of the king. Now, we have the 7 I wills of Satan. We have the multiple I wills of the Lord. But these are the 7 he wills of the king. He's going to take all your good stuff. He's going to oppress your kids. And if your daughters are good looking, he's going to take them too. He's going to take, and in that day when you have been oppressed by the king that you chose, you will cry out to the Lord, and he will not answer you. But the people still don't repent. They still demand a king. And in chapter 9, we see the king that is chosen. Now, here we have Saul. He's going to be the first king, and it starts off with an introduction of him. We're given a little bit of family history just to see kind of where he is. But I want you to understand verse 2. Verse 2 is very, very important. We are told the physical description of Saul, that he was a choice and a handsome man. He was more handsome than anyone in Israel. If you had a contest on that day who was the best looking, Saul would win. And not only was he ridiculously good looking, he was taller than anyone else. So if you all got together for a big, large grouping of Israel, he's the one you would see standing up, and he's really good looking too. Now, here's why this is important. The physical description of Saul is important because Saul represents the king the people would have chosen for themselves. If Samuel said, go pick yourselves out a king, they would have picked Saul. And while David is capable, godly, and also handsome, he would not have been chosen by Israel over Saul. Saul didn't even want David on his side when it was time to face Goliath. Saul is the king that Israel would choose. David is the king that God would choose. It's important to remember. But we have this narrative. Saul is going to look for his family's donkeys. He's a good kid. He's faithful to his father, and the donkeys get away, so he goes looking for them with a servant. And while they're out looking, they can't seem to find him, so the idea comes to him, hey, let's go see the local seer. Now, when we see seer, don't think like a psychic or divine person or anything like that. This was a reference that Israel would use for a prophet. They were a seer. This is a stark contrast to what we will see later on in the book of 1 Samuel, where Saul actively goes to seek the witch of Endor. But here he's seeking a seer to get wisdom from the Lord. The day before Saul goes to meet with Samuel, though, to ask him about these lost donkeys, God tells Samuel, tomorrow I'm going to bring you a guy from the tribe of Benjamin. You're going to anoint him to be leader over Israel. Saul approaches Samuel on the next day. Samuel tells him, don't worry about the donkeys. And he starts to speak glowingly of Saul. Who is the desire of all of Israel for? Is it not your family? Is it not you? Now, verse 20 seems a bit odd to us. It just seems like a bunch of over-the-top compliments. But Saul understands what Samuel is declaring, according to the culture of the day, that Saul is going to be the king. And he responds in verse 21 with what appears to be humility, right? How could this be? Why are you saying this about me? I come from the smallest tribe, and we're the smallest family in the smallest tribe. And it looks really good, right? He's this really humble guy. But this is not humility, it's insecurity. Insecurity is dangerous. We will see this play out throughout the latter part of 1 Samuel. As insecurity leads to jealousy, jealousy leads to hate. In chapter 10, Samuel gets Saul off by himself. He tells them, this is the following day, tell your servant to go on ahead of us. I want to speak to you alone. And while they're alone, he anoints Saul with oil. This is the anointing of the Lord upon him. It demonstrates the Spirit of the Lord that will come upon him in verse 6. And while they're together, he tells them a series of signs that are going to confirm what Samuel is telling him. When you leave here, you're going to run into this guy. He's going to say this to you, et cetera, et cetera. But the big sign that we need to see comes in verse 10 through 11. That Saul will come in contact with a group of prophets. When he gets there, he will begin to prophesy. Now, the incident and the proverb that comes out of this is a little bit tough for us to understand because we don't really get what it is that they're saying. Some of the difficulties when we see the word prophesy, and we start to assume what that means. All right, so the Hebrew word for prophesy that's used here means to speak or sing by inspiration. This is not speaking in tongues in the way that we think of it from a New Testament, 1 Corinthians 14 perspective. The way we think of the gift of tongues doesn't appear in the Old Testament the way we think about it. There is a reference that Paul will use in the New Testament pointing back to Isaiah 28, but even when you look at Isaiah 28, we're kind of like, I'm not getting how these two harmonize. But regardless, what we have here is Saul coming among a group of prophets, and God inspires him to declare the words and glory of God. This is out of character for Saul. This is why it stands out. The idea of the proverb that comes out of it is Saul also among the prophets. This proverb is clarified just a little bit by what happens right before it. When you look at verse 11, it says, what has happened to the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets? Therefore, I present to you that this proverb means one of two things. Either that God can take someone who is non-religious, not a religious bone in their body, as it were, and inspire them to declare the words of God. That God can take someone who does not have a heart for him and use that person to declare his words. Or, and this is the one I kind of lean more towards, but if you have better ideas, I'd love to hear it too. Or that God can take someone from a humble lineage and elevate them to declare his glory. So it could be, what's gotten into Saul? Is Saul also among the prophets? Or, what's happened to the son of Kish? Did God really take somebody from a know-nothing tribe and a know-nothing group and elevate them to declare his glory? I don't know. Either one could be. All right, regardless. All this happens, so it confirms to Saul that what Samuel said is true. He gets home, he reports into his dad, he finds out about the donkeys. His dad's like, what happened to you? Oh, I went and saw Samuel. What did he say? Oh, he said the donkeys were found. Doesn't mention anything about being a king. Even though all those confirmations happened, he should go, Dad, I'm not sure what's going on, but this is what he said. Samuel shows up and he calls for a gathering of all the nation, so likely the representatives of the tribes, and casting lots, he demonstrates before Israel that Saul is to be the king. Now, he already knows Saul's going to be the king. Saul already knows that Saul's going to be the king, so what's going on? What God is doing by allowing other people to cast these lots, sanctified dice, or however you want to think about it in your head, is to show to everybody that this decision was not from the heart of Samuel. Samuel didn't just go and choose his favorite. And they can go later on, well, you picked him. No, this is from the Lord. This is an application of Proverbs 16:33. Proverbs 16:33, the lot is cast in the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. Well, the lot comes all the way down to Saul. It gets down to, and they start looking for Saul, and they can't find him. So they go and they cry out to the Lord, and they ask the Lord where Saul was, and God reveals that Saul was hiding among the baggage. Now, the idea of it is just comical in our head because we've already been told he's taller than anybody else, so he's a big dude. So in my mind, I have this image of this like pro wrestler trying to hide behind this little piece of luggage like nobody can see him. And it seems funny to us, right? It's actually quite a troublesome sign. Now, contrast this to when Samuel is going to go looking for David in just a little bit, and when he goes, don't you have another kid? And he goes, yeah, he's out tending the sheep. He is busy about his father's business. Whereas Jesus, when Mary and Joseph go looking for him, when he ends up being at the temple, he's sitting there asking questions of the teachers. He's studying about the Lord. And when they go, why did you do this thing? Didn't you know we'd be worried? He goes, why are you worried? Didn't you know that I needed to be about my father's business? This is the concern. His heart is not for the Lord. It's thinking about himself, but Israel doesn't see this concern. Instead, they're impressed by the sight of him. It's kind of how Samuel presents him. Do you see who the Lord has chosen? Is there anyone like him in Israel? And they respond with, long live the king. Now, Saul goes home. A group of valiant men become his bodyguards, but he doesn't begin to really rule. He goes back to the family business, as it were. And in the next chapter, we're told that there is this city that's been sieged by the Ammonites. The Ammonites have come and surrounded this city, and this city, Jabesh Gilead, they go, listen, come on, let's play nice. Let's make a peace covenant. They go, sure, we'll make a peace covenant. If you let us poke out one of your eyes, we'll have a peace covenant. And they go, well, that's a great offer, but do you mind if we go and send messengers out and see if anyone will come and rescue us? Now, here is the hubris of the Ammonite army. They are so arrogant and so overconfident, they're like, sure, see if anybody can save you from our hand. Now, word reaches Saul of what's happening, and when it does, we find that he's working in the field. He's walking behind the oxen. Now, he's not walking in the fullness of the office that he has been called to. He's the king. He's out here doing manual labor. Not that there's anything wrong with the leader doing what needs to be done, but the point is that he has not walked in what it is that the Lord has called him to do. But when he hears of this news, we're told that the Spirit of God came upon him. And it's so similar to what we see throughout the book of Judges with several of the judges, where the Spirit of the Lord will come upon them to equip them to do what they could not do normally on their own. It was not in the heart of Saul to be able to go and jump into this fight by himself, but the Lord enables him and gives him a heart to do it. And so what he does is he sends out a stern call for soldiers, and 30,000 Israelite soldiers show up to join in the fight. What is interesting is when he sends out word about this in this stern call, he takes the ox that he was just plowing with, and he chops them into pieces, and he sends those pieces throughout Israel. Remember what happened at the end of Judges? Something to be aware of. Well, Saul sends word to Jabesh Gilead. He says, you will be saved by tomorrow. When the sun gets hot tomorrow, you will be delivered. And Saul's true to his word. They go and they fight, and the Lord delivers the Ammonites into the hands of Saul. But I need you to understand something here. The men of Jabesh Gilead will never forget this kindness by Saul. Regardless of all the things that will happen, regardless of how the nation will have a heart for David, they will never forget that Saul rescued them during this time. And when Saul is killed at the end of 1 Samuel, and his body is hung up on the walls of Beth-shen to humiliate him, it's the men of Jabesh Gilead who will go and cut the bodies down and give both Saul and his sons a proper burial. And they'll do it in such a way that no one can ever come and even take their bones and desecrate them again. Israel goes from this battle to Gilgal, where Saul will be formally crowned and received as king by all of Israel. Now, the reason this is done at Gilgal, not at Jerusalem as we might think, or anywhere else, is likely because this is the first place where Israel camped when they came into the Promised Land. Remember that monument of 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan River? This is where they put the monuments. This was the headquarters of Joshua when they started to move into the Promised Land, so this becomes the first headquarters or the first palace for Saul. In chapter 12, Samuel gives his final address to the nation as judge. They've moved into having their king, the king's ruling now. I love the way he does it. He starts off going, okay, here I'm standing before you. Anybody have a problem with me? Speak now or forever hold your peace. And like, no, you've never done anything wrong. You've been a great judge. He goes, well, before the Lord is your witness, you're saying that I never cheated you, never defrauded you, never did anything wrong. No, you've been great. And then he just lets them have it. He tells them about their history. He reveals how God delivered wicked generations before them through the judges, even though they didn't deserve to be saved. And when the newest threat came, this is verse 12, Rather than calling out to the Lord for another judge, they rejected God as king, and they asked for a king like other nations. Verse 13 through 18 is important for Israel. Samuel lays out the choice before Israel and their king. What he's telling them, the choices don't change now that you got yourselves a fancy king. You don't get to do what you want to do just like everybody else. You are still the people of God. The choices are the same from the days of Moses. From Deuteronomy 11, I have set before you a blessing and a curse. Deuteronomy chapter 30, I have set before you life and death. Joshua in Joshua chapter 24, choose today who you will serve. And it's the exact same here. Verse 14, if you will fear the Lord and serve him. Verse 15, or if you will not and will reject him. Those are the only two choices. There are no other. Chapter 13. Verse 1 tells us that Saul was 30 at the beginning of his reign, and he will be king for 42 years. I like the way chapter 13 gets going, though, because we immediately go over to Jonathan, and we see Jonathan starting a fight with the Philistines. Now, everyone else is in a camp. Jonathan goes and he starts striking down a garrison of the Philistines. Now, when the other Israelites hear about this, the people of Israel are summoned. It's interesting that it's reported that Saul did this. Saul didn't do it. It was Jonathan, but Saul doesn't mind taking the credit. But the people start gathering. Okay, Saul's about to do some action, so let's get going. And as they start to gather around Saul, the Philistines hear about it, and they bring up their army. They bring up 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and foot soldiers beyond number. We're going to find out at the end of the chapter, Israel doesn't even have swords. They don't have any of the implements of war themselves. And this show of force by the Philistines frightened the Israelites. And they go and start hiding in caves, and some of them flee across the Jordan River. Because of the fear of the people, Saul feels like he's got to do something. So he goes and he offers a burnt offering to the Lord instead of waiting for Samuel. Remember who offered the burnt offering before? It was Samuel. As soon as the offering was offered, here comes Samuel. He shows up and he goes, what did you do? Saul responds by blaming everybody but himself. Well, the people were fleeing, and you didn't show up. And the Philistines are like right there. Therefore, I forced myself to offer this. I didn't want to, but you made me. Samuel chastises Saul and tells him that because of his disobedience, that his house would not endure. The disobedience is likely a reference to verse 8, where it says there was an appointed time set by Samuel of 7 days. He says, I know what's going on. 7 days, I'll be there. A fullness of time to just wait. Wait for the deliverance of the Lord. I don't care if they're bringing their attack. You wait until I show up, because Samuel understands that even as you're offering the burnt offering, if that's when they choose to attack, the Lord will deliver the enemy into your hands. But because of this, because Saul would not wait, because he chose to take matters into his own hand, as we will see later, Saul will get to do, in his mind, will get to do whatever he wants to do as long as he puts royal robes and religious robes on it. But because of this, the house of Saul will not endure, and Saul will fight against this all of his days. Now, verse 14 is important. It is both beautiful and sad at the same time. Verse 14 says that the Lord sought out for himself a man after his own heart. And we'll see who he's talking about. He's talking about David, a man who will have a very messy history. But in all of his days, he is desperate for the Lord. Now, it's beautiful. It gives us great hope. But here's where it's so sad. It doesn't refer to Jonathan. And when you look at the short life that we have of Jonathan, Jonathan has a heart for the Lord. But because of the sin of his father, Jonathan will have to deal with the effects of his iniquity, and his house will not even get a chance to get started. The end of the chapter sets the stage for the battle. We find out Israel is completely outgunned, and that's where we'll end for today. So your homework for next time is the next 18 chapters of 1 Samuel, but you could do it, and I have confidence in you. And then we'll go into 2 Samuel, and we'll finish up this block and take a couple weeks for our brain to rest before we go into the books of the Kings. So that is where we will end for the study tonight. I cannot express to you enough how beautiful Ruth is. That is one book we were just not going to run past and not give it its due, and we definitely didn't give it its due, but we tried to. And the things we talked about, the allusions to Jesus within it, they but scratched the surface. If you look at how the applications of love within that, you can apply that application to yourself. That is the way Jesus sees you. Father, we love you. Lord, we thank you. I thank you for the beauty of your word, just the majesty, the brilliance of it, how it is just so dense with meaning. But at the same time, it's so simple, a child can understand it. You're beyond amazing, Lord. You are beautiful, and you are so very good. So we dedicate our hearts to you. We love you, Lord. Father, I thank you for the students and the scholars. I thank you for those who come on Tuesday as well, Lord. I pray that your word and your spirit will bring to our remembrance exactly what it is that we need, that you'll plant those seeds down deep and you'll water them accordingly so that all of our lives will glorify you. Father, we love you. I just thank you for Ruth. I thank you for your word. I thank you for what you do in our lives. Lord, thank you for never giving up on us and always giving us hope. Lord, be with us today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Family, we'll have one last song of worship. If you need